What are your expectations for Elden Ring and its Shadow of the Erdtree DLC? What kind of experience are you hoping to derive from your time spent in-game? What's your perspective on difficulty in games? And is this title your go-to game for months and months, or are you just hoping to overcome its challenges and move on? I think more than any other piece of From Software content before, these questions matter, and will completely guide your thoughts on this expansion. It was true of the base game, and it's perhaps even more true going into Shadow of the Erdtree. By continuously pushing difficulty farther and farther, From Software has left themselves in a position that they really haven't been in before, stuck in the middle. On one hand, you have a fanbase whose extreme passion for these games, particularly Elden Ring, guides their perspective. They see the difficulty as not unfair, but a daunting task for only the bravest to overcome, and they play the game over and over and over again as a result. On the other hand, you have players who want to see everything this package has to offer before moving on to the next game. And both of these perspectives are valid. Everyone is a paying customer after all. Me personally, I find myself more in the latter camp. I wanted to play through Shadow of the Erdtree once or twice before moving on, not perfecting my skills, but enjoying it before something new comes along. Savoring it, but not overindulging on it. Regardless of which camp you fall into, and how you personally feel about the expansion, at the end of the day, I can only speak to my own experience. This channel is predicated on me, duh, and I can only share what I think while doing my best to understand the perspective of others. For me, I'm not the most hardcore gamer out there. I enjoy the From Software games, but I'm by no means an expert, just a fan, here to play, explore, fight, and move on, eager to return the next time something new comes along. As a result, the scope of this review will be more narrow than others, and if that turns you away, I understand. That being said, I think there's value in reviewing games from someone who doesn't get to play them 10 hours a day, but instead 10 hours a week. Finding balance between a love of gaming, along with plenty of sleep, working a 9 to 5, and maintaining a social life. That's not an insult, by the way, it's just my own situation. So hopefully you can understand it, and I'll do my best to understand your situation. Before watching this video, I would recommend checking out my review of Elden Ring from 2 years ago. I looked back on it in preparation for writing this script, and I feel a lot of my initial thoughts are still true to my experience here. Overall, when it comes to Shadow of the Erdtree, I can confidently say that you should 100% buy this DLC if you were hooked by the base game. In many ways, it feels like the most substantial and jam-packed DLC package gaming has ever seen, rivaled only by other immaculate add-ons like The Witcher 3's Blood and Wine expansion. The Land of Shadow is beautiful and dense, channeling the verticality of the original Dark Souls more than any From Software game has since. And it's a world full of discovery, moments that will stand out in your mind, whether they act as mini set pieces or a reimagining of concepts from the base game. It's undeniably polished and gorgeous throughout, and littered in these lands are tons of new tools for you to try out regardless of what build you have. Overall, lots of great considerations and additions to be found here. But at the heart of it all is once again the bosses, the biggest pieces of controversy within this otherwise stellar package. In my original Elden Ring review, I warned that the From Software games continue to push difficulty further and further. What felt like a natural evolution from Demon Souls to Dark Souls to Bloodborne is now starting to venture into the realm of feeling a bit unfair, or perhaps just insurmountable, at least to me as an average player. The game's expectations of the player have never been higher when it comes to boss fights, and these ones here will demand more out of you than most from before. What felt like progression for the studio at first is starting to turn to absurdity. Even going from Elden Ring's base game to the DLC, this has become apparent to me, and it gives me concern for the studio's future. Some will laugh at that statement, perhaps deservedly so. Honestly, that's probably the truth. but someday even the elite players may find themselves saying something similar upon the release of Dark Souls 4, Elden Ring 2, or Bloodborne 2. Or maybe they won't. I can't speak for other players, and if you love getting your ass kicked repeatedly until finally breaking through, well, I have good news for you. Shadow of the Erdtree will be right up your alley. Anyway, let's get into the assessment proper now. All I ask is that we respect each other's perspectives. My criticisms are not aimed to dumb down future games, but instead correct some of the issues as I see them so that future titles can be even better. Oh, and this video will contain major spoilers from here on out, so please be wary of that. Okay, let's get started. To access Shadow of the Erdtree, you'll have to beat Radahn and Mohg in the base game. Radahn is acceptable and necessary, as we will come to see, but many questioned whether Mohg was necessary. To that I say, yeah, probably. I mean, they could have put it somewhere else instead of behind an optional boss, but let's face facts. If you're interested in buying this DLC, you probably beat Mohg already. The difficulty of the DLC demands at least a level 140 to 150 character to start, again, for us non-godly players, so hiding it behind an endgame boss like this doesn't seem like the worst idea. Of course, for those simply wanting to play the DLC on a new character, a lot of time will be spent hunting down map fragments, stocking up on healing flasks, leveling up stats and a weapon, and more. More than any other From DLC before, Erdtree requires time from you, and it isn't always going to be interesting riding around Limgrave for the Xth amount of time. Still, hopping into the DLC provides an immediate spark of joy. You're teleported to a cave, and you already know damn well what's coming. Gorgeous view ahead. After not playing this game for a little under 2 years now, the sight of this brought a rush of excitement. A massive new world to explore full of possibilities, and when it comes to world design and exploration, it certainly does not disappoint. The Land of Shadow is categorized best by its verticality, taking the sense of discovery felt in the base game and heaping on layers. Literally. At first, the graveyard plains seem unyielding in their flatness, but it quickly gives way to pathways. Lots and lots of pathways. Perhaps venture upwards to the Bellerut Legacy Dungeon, or perhaps down to the base of this waterfall, or loop around here to reach the shoreline, or hell, just stay on this level and go towards Castle Ensis. Whichever you choose, something will be there to blow you away. For example, imagine riding through a cave system, exploring for a good 20 to 30 minutes, climbing down slippery rocks surrounded by waterfalls, only to emerge in a meadow. You think, well, this is not bad, but I've already seen an area like this. But then you step through a little tunnel and you see this. What a view. It's incredible and one you really earn by exploring everything. The journey here is not a short one and it's very easy to miss, but this view, man, that's a reward in of itself. The point here is that the base game's mantra of, oh, you're stuck somewhere? Well, just go somewhere else, is still at the core of exploration here in the DLC, and it's arguably never been better. Every time I came face to face with a tough boss, there was always somewhere else I could go, up until the final boss, and that's a great feeling. It's not easy to walk away from a boss who's kicking your butt, but knowing that you can always come back later, and that there's more to see, is always a great option to have. But let's not talk combat yet, because I'm not done praising the world design. One thing I loved about the original Dark Souls was how its map kept pushing me up and down, and while Erdtree doesn't quite have the same level of interconnectedness as that title's first half, it's still as strong a showing as we've seen since when it comes to verticality. Even after those first few decisions on where to go, the game does not relent on options as you continue to progress. There are so many times where you'll find yourself saying, oh, I've finally reached the highest point on the map, only to find somewhere even further up later on. And the same goes for moving downwards. I reached the shoreline and thought, oh, hell, surely I can't go any lower than this, only to discover a giant hole in the ground that led to a completely hidden portion of the world. And of course, it was absolutely breathtaking to uncover because, Of course it was. This is Miyazaki and team we're talking about here. Now, this verticality isn't always easy to comprehend when looking at the 2D map, but that's more a weakness of the menus than it is the world. To me, the trade-off is worth it because the sense of discovery is so palpable. Asking yourself, how do I get up or down there, only to find the pathway on your own is immensely satisfying, and you're rewarded for doing so. Seriously, almost every time you discover a new area, you're greeted with an incredible vista to soak in, taking a second to breathe it in before venturing forward to get your ass kicked once more. For real, it's true of like 75% or more of the areas within this DLC, and the use of color is just stunning. Entire areas can be defined by a single color. Blue, red, yellow, green, and gray all come to mind, and it's stunning, truly. It's not hard to notice as you ride through the open sections on Torrent's back. Of course, the world is more than just a painting-like entrance to most of its areas. It's chock full of moments built to evoke an emotion or memory within you. Whether it's the exciting rush of riding up a towering furnace golem as it sends a whirlwind of flames right at you, or the utter dread that wells up within your gut as you sneak past invincible, frenzied flame foes who make winter lanterns look like child's play. Or the sense of awe that comes from uncovering the most massive dead dragon you've ever seen. Or how the statues of the specimen storage room can be moved, creating new pathways reminiscent of levels we've seen before. Or the joy of finally finding a waterfall that has a secret hidden behind it. Or the sense of intrigue from uncovering this. What the hell is this? And so many more moments. The playthrough is always punctuated with these moments, highlighting basic exploration in a way that the base game never quite could. Sure, it had moments of discovery too, but these little set-piece moments to uncover weren't nearly as featured or frequent, and stumbling into so many here just feels incredible. It takes exploration to a new level, surpassing the base game in my mind. Another reason for that is how the DLC has reworked some of the concepts from the base game, principally mini dungeons that take the form of catacombs, forges, forts, and ruins. They all maintain their original purpose, providing a quick experience to be had culminating with a boss encounter at times. However, a handful of them are now tied to exploration progression, meaning that you can uncover brand new areas by completing them. It is an insane feeling to go through an unassuming little dungeon only to come out and realize that this is how you access 2 new areas within the DLC. I loved that feeling. It felt like a small choice being rewarded massively. On top of the open world exploration, the DLC also contains 2 new legacy dungeons, the Bellerot Settlement and the Shadowkeep/Specimen Storehouse. To be fair, I didn't find these 2 dungeons to be quite as memorable as the ones in the base game, although the Specimen Storehouse easily trumps the Bellerot Settlement. The settlement can be accessed fairly early and is one of the first intended paths for you to take, but truth be told, I found it a bit underwhelming. A solid sense of verticality and hidden areas, but nothing that really blew me away. Meanwhile, the Specimen Storehouse is better, containing a library at its core with intermoving parts and staircases filled with hidden areas that feel much more meaningful to uncover. Finding everything here will take some serious investment, but it's well worth doing for how many NPC quest lines, new locations, and even boss fights are tied to this pivotal location. So, all in all, exploring the Land of Shadows for your first time is incredibly satisfying, chock full of moments of discovery and player-driven fun, and littered with points of interest and epic moments to uncover. So, what's the downside? Well, it's 2-part. First of all, let's face facts once again. These games are meant to be replayed. There is a certain core part of the player base that will revisit these games time and time again. I think one problem with Elden Ring's massive size is that each new playthrough will require a lot of time to recollect map fragments and move through the world. The repetitive nature of this will see many surprising encounters lose their appeal once you know it's out there. Stumbling across 2 dragons fighting one another is awesome the first time, and is still cool a few more times after that, let's be honest, but after a while, the appeal runs thin. Familiarity breeds disinterest, making an epic world feel more mechanical. This is true of every game, but the downside for Elden Ring is that exploration is required for most players, and that's more true here in the DLC. You'll need those map fragments once more, and having to pick them up on every subsequent run feels tedious, and when the cool moments lose their luster, that drive to explore for them becomes more of a grind. That was already true in the base game, but From Software doubled down on this with the inclusion of scadutree fragments, which are the DLC's form of level progression. Leveling up your stats normally here means very little against the incredibly strong bosses that reside here. Instead, to get an edge, you'll have to collect and consume scadutree fragments to boost your damage dealt while negating incoming damage, while doing the same with revered spirit ashes that level up your spirit summons. Unless you are in an upper percentile of skilled players, these two items will be absolutely necessary to progressing further within the DLC, as without them, bosses are very much capable of mopping the floor with you. That means every time you want to play through the DLC again, you can't just mainline the fights with any sort of balance. Revisiting the experience almost requires that you seek out these fragments, many of them to be honest, whether you like it or not. And I think that's a shame considering how important replayability is to From Software games and their audience. Of course, that leads me to the second problem, and that's that I don't think requiring scadutree fragments and revered spirit ash is even that great of an idea on the first playthrough. I think players are naturally inclined to explore in Elden Ring their first time through, and tying an item so pivotal to combat progression with exploration means it can be very limiting for those who just want to get a move on with the bosses, particularly on later runs as already mentioned, but it's still true on a first run. I guess they feared that players will have built like level 400 characters on a new game, prepared to walk into the DLC and just mollywop every boss. Well, honestly, if you spend the time to get to that level, then you deserve to beat the crap out of every boss with ease. More understandable though is that weapon progression would have had to be completely overhauled for the DLC. If bosses get harder, but your weapons can't hit harder because they're maxed out from the base game, that could be an issue. So I understand that From didn't make the scadutree fragment decision lightly, and were perhaps required to, but it still has issues nonetheless. The fear of already maxed out builds with no way to increase power further was too much, so now scadutree fragments, for better or worse, are your main form of mitigating the disadvantages. So how do these items work? Well, essentially, upon gathering up a handful of them, like 2 or 3, they can be popped at sites of grace to increase your scadutree and spirit ash blessing level. The first 2 scadutree fragment upgrades will increase damage dealt and decrease damage received by roughly 10%, and then continue to increase by less and less, plateauing around level 12 where the benefits are severely neutered. Level 12 acts as a soft cap much in the same way that stats can be soft capped upon leveling. It should also be noted that the stats granted by the blessings are only present in the DLC area and do not affect the base game. However, the benefits garnered through leveling up in this method cannot be understated, as without them, bosses will surely feel too tanky, while also being capable of wrecking you in just a few hits, depending on your build. So whether you like it or not, if you aren't a god tier player, you're going to need those scadutree fragments at the very least. Now, to be fair, they are pretty easy to find. Many are placed right along the main pathway, or by sites of grace. Hell, some are even marked with a giant yellow cross that is impossible to miss, and is also one of my favorite designs in the entire game. I love the simplicity of it, but that's beside the point. You can also find fragments by killing hippos. Killing one of them will always drop 1 or 2 sometimes, which is appreciated. So overall, the scadutree fragments and the revered spirit ashes aren't terribly hard to find, but they will require a lot of repeated exploration on subsequent playthroughs, and the downsides of that cannot be easily mitigated. You can't recapture the same joy felt from exploration in a first playthrough, and when exploration is mostly mandatory, it's kind of a recipe for boredom. But of course, even as I just mentioned, even on that first playthrough, the importance of the scadutree fragments cannot be overstated because bosses in this DLC, particularly the Remembrance variants, can be absolutely brutal. To be fair, right off the bat, you can practically hit the soft cap for scadutree blessings before even facing one of the DLC's 11 major bosses, which is commendable. It will require some serious devotion to exploration or the aid of an online guide. I want to make it clear though that it is doable, and walking into the first 4 or 5 intended Remembrance bosses with a scadutree blessing of 12 will surely make them much easier. But the point I want to begin this combat section with is that this will not be the path for most. Many players will be under the soft cap upon facing the first few Remembrance bosses, which will lead to an ass whooping, but not an insurmountable one. But what's more scary is reaching the final boss with a nearly maxed out scadutree blessing level and still getting your ass whooped knowing that there isn't much more you can do short of changing up your playstyle. Arguably even worse though is reaching a boss past the intended scadutree blessing level and having it be a total pushover because you're now over leveled with no way to undo it. This happened to me with 2 of the Remembrance bosses. The number of scadutree blessings you acquire will greatly influence your perspective on the bosses and can make them seem out of sorts, going from a hard one to another hard one to an easy one to a really hard one, and so on and so forth, depending on how you've chosen to explore the map and the boss's moveset. As a result, in my personal experience, it felt like scadutree fragments aren't the optimal solution for tuning DLC difficulty because of how hard they make it to play through the intended experience for each boss. Was I supposed to beat Romina in one go, or was I just over-leveled? Was I supposed to explore more before Relena, or was she meant to be this hard? I can't say for sure because I don't know what level I was supposed to be at for them. Truly, you can rebuttal this point by asking, who cares? You're supposed to decide for yourself what is too hard and seek out helpful resources if that's the case. But inevitably, it will make everyone's playthrough a little bit different, and I think that's a large reason for all the discourse online concerning this DLC's difficulty. Every player may be at a different blessing level, which will greatly influence their thoughts. It makes their experience one that is true to them, and their opinions on the DLC will be reflected by that experience. You can't tell someone that it's easy when you had 10 blessings for Dancing Lion while they only had 2. And without some universal way to know what the intended blessing level is for each boss, there's no real way to assess the difficulty fairly across every playthrough, especially considering different builds and player skill level on top of things. Again, I don't think the scadutree blessings are perfect, but they give as much freedom as possible to collecting and using them, and that's appreciated. So I'm not necessarily criticizing their inclusion, but instead pointing out how greatly they influence the perception of a playthrough. I think it's the biggest component of explaining why the difficulty discourse has been so back and forth online. It's all inherently subjective, and I can only speak to my own experience, and that's what I'll do now. So, with all of that being said, this shit is hard, dude. Yeah, it's brutal. I think moving through the overworld and through the legacy dungeons is great. Most non-boss enemies aren't too much of a pain. Some challenges here and there, especially among some of the field bosses, of which there are many. Particularly dragons. Seriously, there's like a dragon around every corner. And overall, basic combat with basic enemies isn't too bad, although I will note that Torrent really should have been buffed more. He goes down way too easily in this DLC. But what I want to focus on mostly is the 10 Remembrance bosses and my experiences with them. They include the Dancing Lion, Relena Twin Moon Knight, Putrescent Knight, Scadutree Avatar, Midra Lord of Frenzied Flame, Mesmer the Impaler, Commander Gaius, Meteor Mother of the Fingers, Romina Saint of the Bud, and Radahn Consort of Mikola. Oh, and let's add Bale the Dread for good measure. So that's the lineup, and let's be real, boss fights are arguably the most important part of most From Software games, and getting them right is one major key to a great experience. In my initial review of Elden Ring, I mentioned that it felt like the bosses were starting to become more and more unfair. Elden Ring gives its players more tools than ever before, but to make up for this, they gave the bosses a lot of cheap tricks to use back. This was true during the later portion of the game, where some bosses felt downright dastardly, particularly Mohg, Malenia, Malekith, Godskin Duo, and even Radagon and the Elden Beast. Malenia was of course the poster child for unfair behavior, but all of these fights seeded concern in me. In From Software's voyage to continuously pump up the difficulty compared to their previous game, do they eventually reach a point where things start feeling downright unfair? At what point do the expectations of player skill become a bit too high? What happens if the required skill floor feels like a tower above the average player's head? I argued that we were starting to reach that in Elden Ring, and it's a concern that hasn't necessarily been fully quelled within this DLC. So I played through the DLC for the first time as a standard dexterity bleed build using the Rivers of Blood and a Blood Ujigatana. I had somewhat heavy armor, but I had enough endurance that I could medium roll. Is it ideal? Is it a perfect build? Hell to the no. Could it be better? Of course! Hell, I didn't even have maxed out flasks at any point throughout this playthrough. So I understand that I didn't do myself every favor possible to prepare for this DLC. Some of the problems are on me. I get that. But what I'm going to do now is raise some points of criticism against the bosses that would remain true even if I walked in with a perfect build and maxed out flasks. So let's list them out while examining the guilty parties. I should note that I did beat Romina and Medir within 1 and 2 attempts respectively, so my understanding of them isn't as concrete as the others. Also, these are problems that remain regardless of your scadutree blessing level, and if that isn't high enough, you can add hitting too hard and being too tanky to the list to come, but that's up to you. First major problem, overaggression. Often the player isn't given enough time between boss attacks to heal properly before a new chain of attacks begin. The flash drinking animation seems a bit too long compared to how fast bosses can queue up a new attack. I'd say this problem is true with Dancing Lion, Putrescent Knight, Mesmir, Romina, Bale, and Radahn. They very rarely relent on their attacks, but the other Remembrance bosses do much better, giving you some time to heal as they meander about. Hell, even Mesmer does it at times. I think giving players a chance to breathe is a good thing, and overly aggressive bosses prevent that. It demands the player play closer to flawless than ever before, because dying to a strong combo is very realistic. Next, we have unrelenting combos that can contain double-digit opportunities to deal damage to you. Sometimes the player is expected to dodge many hits in a row, all with unique timings owed to another issue, delayed attacks. These two problems go hand in hand, so I'm lumping them together. When a combo can last 5, 7, 8, 10, 12 strikes in a row, asking the player to dodge with perfect timing to mitigate all damage is a lot, especially when they aren't always evenly timed out. This, paired up with the overaggression, leads to you eating a ton of damage. The result here is that many fights don't feel like a natural back and forth, but instead a futile attempt to manage your resources and hope the boss cooperates enough to let you get enough damage in. Of course, if you take a hit or two and see half your health get shredded, you may not even have time to get that hit in because you're gonna want to heal, because the next attack could just kill you. And if they're over-aggressive, it's right back to the loading screen if you aren't perfect. The amount of time they have to damage you versus the amount of time you have to damage them seems borderline unfair. Bosses that feature these problems include Relena, Putrescent Knight, Mesmer, and Radahn. Arguably some others, but I'm trying to think of ones that have tons of long combos. Okay, what else do we have? Oh, AoE attacks that will mega punish you with status ailments. Many bosses utilize a status effect alongside of their physical damage output. The damage alone is enough to make you go crazy, but it's really the positioning and the effect I want to point out here, since damage is reliant on blessings. Scarlet Rot, Shock, Bleed, Frostbite, Madness, and more are all capable of seriously sapping your health bar while possibly adding on another effect like slowing you down. These attacks are sometimes predictable and easily dodged, but other times they come at you so fast that if you're in range, you're taking damage, or are chained to the end of normal physical attacks, meaning you can dodge the physical attack and then get hit by the AoE. It's like chip damage in some instances that feels particularly punishing and overwhelming at times. Oh, and the bosses are not afraid to use these huge AoE moves right at the beginning of the fight to punish players wanting to summon Spirit Ashes. This problem is true of Dancing Lion, Scadutree Avatar, Putrescent Knight, Mesmer, Midra, Romina, Verlana, Bale, and Radon. That's a lot, man. Another big detractor from giving the player time to think and react would be how fast bosses move around the arena. Many of them are capable of traversing great distances, closing gaps in a hurry, punishing you for running away, and genuinely being a pain to find a moment to heal. This sort of goes hand in hand with the over-aggressive complaint, but yeah, they leap around everywhere. This problem is true of Dancing Lion, Verlana, Gaius, Midra, Mesmer, Scadutree Avatar, Bale, and Radon. Again, it demands a higher skill output from the player, and while that is possible, it's not necessarily feasible for those who don't want to spend hours and hours and hours and hours grinding away at a single foe. Again, I'll come back to it, fights don't always feel like fair back and forth, but instead a litany of failed attempts culminating in one fight where the boss acted a bit unnatural, or you got a bit lucky, and you learned just enough, and they cooperated just enough that you overcome it. And the final problem I want to outline is, again, two mixed into one: boss size and the camera. Some of these bosses are huge and have awkward lock-on points. Because they flail around so much with their unyielding combos, players who lock on may see the camera flying all over the place. The simple solution sounds like not locking on, but this doesn't always solve the problem, especially against bigger bosses because you can't quite see what they are doing and sound cues only go so far. At the same time, many of these bigger bosses will move out of range of your attacks simply by starting an attack animation. In other words, you can dodge an attack and go to hit them, but the rest of the moves in the boss's combo move them far enough away that you're out of range for your attack to land, and that is so annoying. You finally get an opening and you're just swinging at air. They can hit you in so many ways, but you miss when they're a few inches in front of you. Ugh, it sucks. And it's true of the Dancing Lion, Mesmer, Metter, Bale, Scadutree Avatar, and Radon. Oh, and shout out to the Golden Hippopotamus on this one too. So these issues remain true regardless of what you choose to do to combat a foe, whether it's changing up your playstyle, using Spirit Ashes, or summoning another player for help. All of these problems contribute to the perceived difficulty and compound when paired up with each other. And as a result, it's starting to feel like more and more bosses are tipping the scale towards being unreasonable. And when you add being a little short on Scadutree blessings to these already existing issues, it only feels worse as bosses shred your health in 2 or 3 hits. Look, I don't envy Miyazaki and team having to balance the bosses as best they could, especially here in the DLC where you must consider the new leveling system on top of all the build options, player levels, Spirit Ashes, and summons. Perhaps all this potential aid for players prompted them to bump up the difficulty, but if you just want to play this game solo without any outside help from summons of any sorts, it's going to be a real test of patience and skill, perhaps a bit too daunting in its expectations of you the player. Now, I'm not saying every boss is way too hard. In fact, some of them I found quite easy, which I don't know if it's because of my Scadutree blessing level or just because they are that way. From easiest to hardest, I'd say we have Metter, Romina, Dancing Lion, Scadutree Avatar, Midra, Putrescent Knight, R'Lana, Gaius, Mesmer, Bale, and Radahn. I tried doing every boss solo for a time. This worked for Metter, Romina, and Dancing Lion, but I ended up summoning my Mimic tier for a few, which trivialized them in the case of R'Lana, Midra, and Putrescent Knight, leading to victories within 1 or 2 attempts of summoning. I also used the Mimic tier for Gaius, Mesmer, Scadutree Avatar, and Bale, which helped me win after a while. And finally, Radahn. Well, yeah. I called in the brigade of big shields with pokey bleed weapon summons, and they helped me beat him. It didn't feel good to do that, but I was losing hope after hours and hours of attempts. So, yeah, that was my experience with the bosses. I'd say the most fun to fight were probably Mesmer and Midra because they at least avoided the camera issues while still providing challenge, although I do think even they had their issues as mentioned in the breakdown. I'd say Metter, Romina, and Dancing Lion were sort of on the easy side, while R'Lana, Midra, Mesmer, and Putrescent Knight felt like the closest to being fair, while Gaius and Scadutree Avatar felt cheap, and Bale and Radahn just felt utterly impenetrable on my own. A decent balance, but even the fairer bosses had their problems. And of course, one name absolutely dominated that breakdown: Radahn. To be honest, I think Malenia is still harder, but that's only due to her health recovery. Radahn won't leech off of you, but he still checks all the boxes for the issues I outlined: overaggression, unyielding combos, AoE moves, fast speed, delayed attacks, and size and camera. He combines them all to curb stomp you. And even if you have a decent Scadutree blessing level, like mine was 18 when I fought him, he still does huge damage to you, and you just kinda tickle him. Now I understand that all of this makes sense for the character and the lore, but at no point in my solo attempts did I ever feel like this was a natural back and forth, or that I even had a chance. It felt unrelentingly cruel in the ways he could mop the floor with me, and I do think that it expects a bit too much. Again, if this is your cup of tea, I'm not trying to take that away from you. I'm not trying to dumb the games down. I'm just noting that it seems like another step towards the games bordering on the line between fair and unfair. And Bale evokes a similar feel. You'll be out there dodging, more dodging and praying, and then dodging some more, and then you'll get in one measly hit before dodging again, until you either get lucky, find a way to cheese, truly learn over hundreds of attempts, or just die over and over. The sweet spot for me is about 10 to 25 attempts on a boss. After that, it starts to feel like it's leeching more and more time away, and it's time I don't necessarily want to spend doing this. Now, could I have bettered my build? Yes. Could I have got more healing flasks? Yes. Could I have changed up my build completely to specifically face each boss? Yes. Could I have summoned Spirit Ashes or other players right from the start? Yes. But to me, those things should not feel required, and when I choose to use them, they shouldn't feel like one-stop shops for cheesing a boss instantly. And at the same time, these adjustments on my end don't change the tendencies of the bosses. I just think some small tweaks would go a long way, like fixing the camera or the lock-on points, or toning down the aggression by like 10 to 20%, or giving players a bit more time to breathe, or removing 1 or 2 moves within a boss's combo. All of these things could have gone a long way in mitigating a bit of the difficulty and rebalancing the scale to where I would personally like it. It's not where everyone would personally like it, but it's true for me. And again, I reiterate, I can only speak for me, but that's what I would have liked to see. I don't want the Souls games to devolve into every boss spamming 10 attacks over and over, requiring perfect dodging to hold on for dear life, only to get in a single hit before it starts again. I also don't want to have to change up my build or playstyle completely to overcome a boss just by capitalizing on a weakness. I think the balance was best in Bloodborne, and since then, the scale hasn't been quite as even. But what I want to add is that and I already said this in the Elden Ring review, but it's true once again, is that many of the thoughts I just shared are impressions more than anything, given I had only completed one single run. And that applies again here, like I just said. Who knows, maybe when I run the DLC with my heavy tank strength character, it will go much smoother. Oh, speaking of that, well, here comes the plot twist. I decided to play through the DLC again using a completely different build, that very strength character I just mentioned. Everything I wrote prior to that previous sentence was done after my first run and before starting my second. I wanted to see how things would change, if my perspective would evolve, to really get a better feel of the difficulty discourse that I've seen online. Could I change my own opinions by playing in a new way? Well, I'll be more brief this time, but let's find out. I should note that this run was on New Game Plus 2, so take that how you will, but I went in with a new mission. I wanted to see what the experience would be like if I hit the soft cap for Scadutree blessings before facing any of the Remembrance bosses and Baal. And again, it really impressed me that this feat was possible. Major credit needs to go to From Software for designing their world so that this is a possibility, but not likely to be uncovered on a first playthrough. So I didn't feel the need to record most of the footage of me running around collecting the blessings, but to reach the soft cap at level 12, it took me about 2 to 2.5 hours. Over 2 hours of collecting all the map fragments, racing through areas, not exploring, but just seeking out these little yellow turds. Hell, I didn't even grab a lot of the revered spirit ash, which would have taken even longer. Oh, and another thing that helped me was that since I had just played the DLC, I knew where a lot of the fragments were. If I came back 6 months later, well, it would have took even longer. All that's to say, well, it's a bit excessive and didn't necessarily excite me for revisiting the DLC in the future, especially given the requirements it takes just to access the Land of Shadow. I thought having to get all the maps again in the base game was a chore, but this certainly seems worse. Going tick for tack with these bosses once more, with a completely new build, helps solidify in my mind how truly subjective difficulty is in Elden Ring. With the soft cap of 12 secured and a lot more poison DPS, I was able to cakewalk through most bosses, beating Relana, Putrescent Knight, Romina, and Dancing Lion in 3 or less tries without even using my Mimic tier. Conversely though, Metter was much harder this time. The Mother of Fingers wiped me out 15 times before I finally got her on the 16th attempt without using my Mimic tier. Really, there's no way I can say that she's the easiest of the Remembrance bosses anymore. It's probably Romina now. Gaius and Scadutree Avatar still seem pretty cheap. Gaius absolutely shreds Torrent's hit with just about any hit, and Scadutree is like, yeah, beat me 3 times. Ugh, I hate that, but the Mimic tier made mincemeat of them, allowing me to win in less than 2 tries against those bosses while using it. Next up were Midra and Mesmer, the 2 bosses who intrigued me most to revisit on the second run to see how things would stack up. I felt close to beating them on my own during the first playthrough, but eventually caught in the Mimic tier who helped me overcome them. Well, I had a similar experience here. I even bumped up my Scadutree blessing to 16 to see if that would help, but sadly, it did not. Mesmer could still easily deplete me from full health if I took 1 hit, because he'd often follow up with long combos. Midra was a bit better, but still did so much damage to me that I ended up opting for the Mimic tier. And I was sort of disappointed because I was hoping they'd feel a bit more like a back and forth fight this time, not a mad dodging frenzy. Mesmer has sort of solidified himself alongside of Baal and Radahn for asking a lot from the player. Maybe not as much as those 2, but still a bit too much. And then there's Baal and Radahn. After facing Midra and Mesmer and finding them to be just as hard as the first time, well, I didn't have high hopes for finding more balanced fights here. And yeah, I got absolutely rocked. My weaker Mimic tier couldn't stand up to them, which was fine. I had no real intentions of beating these two again, I just wanted to test how much damage I was doing. And to be honest, I was outputting quite a bit, but those problems from earlier kept creeping up and shredding my health bar as a result. It doesn't feel good to get hit by one move in a combo, only to have the boss go right into another that finishes you off without any time to recover. Both of these bosses still feel brutally tough. Radahn at least feels more fair in the sense that you can see what he's doing at all times, but he's so aggressive and strong from the first second that it's hard to overcome it. I still think he and Bale are a little bit overtuned. Again, I don't want to over-exaggerate, just a little bit of correction and I think they'd be a lot better. And Mesmer's right on that cusp too. So, yeah, that was pretty much my second run. To be clear, this second playthrough didn't necessarily change my overall criticisms of the design of the bosses. Those problems I outlined earlier are still there. The over-aggression, the super long heavily punishing combos, the AoEs, the wild camera, the status ailments, etc. I still think there's ways to do boss fights better, but I will concede that I really came to understand how people form different perspectives. I can read angry Reddit posts now bashing a boss, followed up by one that praises it, and I get it now. I can better understand just how much goes into each player's experience, how one player's experience can vary between two different playthroughs. I look back on what I wrote after playing through it just once, and while I still agree with most of it, I can better appreciate how some extra scadutree blessings can make some of the bosses a bit more manageable. Well, that and lots of poise. Oh, and some more skill would go a long way, but I don't really have that. Again, the problems are still there, but some bosses aren't quite as bad as they may initially seem, especially the early ones. This is doubly true if you have knowledge on your side, knowing how to hit the blessing soft cap before tackling them. And I think there's value in that, at least for me personally, getting to challenge my own perspective as a reviewer between one playthrough and the next. It does make a difference. I hope that this was a helpful exercise, although I do fear it will be more interesting to me as the player than you as the viewer of this video, but anyway, yeah. In short, there's bosses, some are good, some are rough, Mimic tier still rocks. If you want easy modes, summon other players. If you want normal, then summon your Mimic tier. And if you want hard mode, do it solo. Oh, and nerf Radahn, please. Okay, that really covers the bulk of what I wanted to discuss in this review. So the next sections on equipment, narrative, and presentation are going to be sort of short. There's channels out there who are far more dedicated to the Souls games than I, and they can cover this stuff better. For instance, there's people who will try out a bunch of different weapons, incantations, spells, spirit ashes, and more, while also doing deep dives into all the lore. I won't be going that hard with it, but I did want to at least mention that I found a ton of new weapons that I could have tried out if I had been so inclined. The DLC is also not shy about handing out the upgrade stones, even the most precious ones, to max out weapon stats, so there's room to experiment if you want. Still, I think it's a hard sell to get players to change up the weapons they've already been using throughout the playthrough just to reach the DLC in the first place. Every time I found something new, I was more interested in reading the lore on it than actually trying it out. This stubbornness may have served as a downfall when it comes to some of the bosses, as I hear that some of the DLC weapons can make some boss fights easier because they're more powerful than those found in the base game, but I didn't test that for myself. Regardless, I just wanted to take a moment to praise the game a bit for making sure that there are a lot of new things to try in Shadow of the Erdtree. Alright, let's touch on the narrative a bit, and I think what impressed me most about Erdtree was how much it leaned into environmental storytelling. This has always been a strength of FromSoft, but I think they've outdone themselves here. Those mini set-piece moments I described earlier do a great job of defining exploration, providing many moments of wonder and intrigue. You're constantly stumbling into scenes that either evoke a fight or flight response in you, or ones that give you pause to wonder. Like, how did that massive dragon die anyway? And who is Charo, and how did he manage to get all the red flowers for himself? Are they turning prisoners into jars here? And what's up with all the fingers? It's moments like these that define your character's story, the one that you, the player, experience as you venture through the DLC. It's the story you make for yourself. The lore tidbits are of course as strong as ever, but I think it's these story moments that are completely player-driven that will stick with me the most. However, if you are a big fan of learning all the lore, then Shadow of the Erdtree is sure to deliver more answers. This really isn't my cup of tea, and I think other channels out there tackle it much better and in more detail than I ever care to, so again, I'll defer to them. But what I will say is that it's nice to see Miquella's backstory fleshed out more. You'll have to do some digging if you want all the details, but it's clear this androgynous wannabe god has come to the Land of Shadows with a sense of purpose. It seems he's come here to revive Radahn, channeling his overwhelming strength as an opportunity to take the crown as Elden Lord and usher in an era of peace. Of course, this peace is revealed to be a coercion more than anything else, not a mutual agreement among sentient people, but instead an enchantment, lulling in everyone and ending suffering at the cost of free will. And as a being who seeks out the throne for ourselves, this competitor stands in our way, which ultimately leads to our clash with him. The cinematography in these cutscenes is outstanding and really helped me to understand these characters more, at least on a surface level. I'll check out Vati's channel for the full breakdown, as should you. While Miquella really is the star of the DLC, hell, you spend the whole time following in his footsteps, there's plenty of new NPCs to meet along the way, although granted, many of them belong to the same coalition. Needle Knight Lita, Dryleaf Dane, the Hornsent, and more are all followers of Miquella, seeking to walk in his footsteps to help him achieve his goal and bring light to his new world. I did complete a few of their quest lines, but more than anything, they served as companions to fight alongside as we made our way towards the final challenge. What impressed me more than their words was their designs, which are as immaculate as ever. FromSoft always comes through so clutch when designing the look of their NPCs to invoke a certain emotion out of you, and it's safe to say, when it comes time to say goodbye to these companions, another gut punch moment will be delivered. It's brilliant. So yeah, plenty of new lore revelations to be had when venturing through the Land of Shadows, if that's your cup of tea. For me personally though, I far more enjoyed forming my own story in my mind as I moved through these varied levels, packed to the brim with moments of awe and discovery. And finally, a few notes on the presentation, and yep, it's From Software. They've once again delivered a flawless experience, at least from what I played through. The worst complaint I can level at the DLC is a bit of pop-in as you ride closer to things in the distance, but it's really not a big deal in the slightest. Meanwhile, my frame rate was consistently excellent, I didn't have any issues with multiplayer or summoning, I had no crashes, and of course the game is absolutely gorgeous. The thing I really wanted to highlight here was how well the DLC utilizes color. You do venture through many biomes within the Land of Shadows, including huge forests, jagged mountains, nasty swamps, underground caves, stunning coastlands, and open plains amongst others. But the funny thing is that I hardly noticed it while playing, as I was too caught up with how color identified the separate levels within the world far more than the plants and geographical structures that I was seeing. The Cerulean Coast is perhaps the most apparent evidence of this with its brilliant blues, but it's also true of other levels. Purple light radiates throughout the caves of the Stone Coffin Fissure. Red flowers bring a fieriness to Charo's hidden grave, making it feel like the antithesis of the Cerulean Coast. And green absolutely litters the Rao Islands floating high above, and the yellow of the Abyssal Woods are more subtle but help lend the area a definite feeling of eeriness. It's undeniable how the use of color affects our perceptions of these areas and helps invoke the intended emotions that the developers wanted. And it doesn't hurt that all of it is gorgeous to look at as well. No matter where you go, even outside the set piece moments, just looking in the distance, you're sure to see something incredible. From Software also displays mastery in their use of sound work, a lot of which is carried over from the base game. I really appreciate the way lightning cackles and whips, and you'll be hearing it a lot. Also a lot of detail in the sound that plays as your character walks on different terrains. And of course, the bosses utilize good audio cues as well, although with everything happening so fast, you'd be forgiven for overlooking them. But it's more than just using sound in smart ways. The team flexed their full understanding by also choosing times to limit the amount of sound you hear, whether that's coming from sound effects or music. This is particularly true in the Abyssal Woods, where everything is meant to creep you out, and silence is a good way of doing just that. Also, the new OST here, yep, it rocks too. So all in all, more great work. And while I don't have much to say on the subject, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention how much I love the message system and the sense of community it delivers. Sure, many messages are just memes, which somehow always get a laugh out of me. It's hilarious how much intent can be derived simply from reading a few words. And at the same time, there are helpful players who genuinely leave great advice, which is always appreciated. So the message system, please never remove it. In many ways, Shadow of the Erdtree not only meets our expectations of From Software, but even exceeds them when it comes to presenting its world in a beautifully and technically sound way. One of the major themes in Shadow of the Erdtree is faith, and how faith can be challenged. As you uncover more backstory, you come to learn that many of the inhabitants in the Land of Shadows are acting on a sense of faith, whether it's natural or forced. Many are beholden to Miquella's vision of peace and fight to the death to defend it. Meanwhile, Mesmer shows absolute faith to his mother Marika, going so far as to unleash his full power to protect her vision for the world. It's all there. Faith. It's interesting because Elden Ring has challenged my faith in From Software's decade-long history of creating challenging but fair gameplay. As this pseudo-series of games has progressed onward from Demon Souls, it really feels like the studio is expecting more and more from its player base. To be fair, this is what the most die-hard fans of the series probably want, more and more challenge. But for a more casual audience, those who enjoy Souls games alongside of many other games and genres, perhaps things are starting to get a bit off kilter. 2 playthroughs of this DLC has not reassured me that From's push for increased difficulty won't eventually spiral out of control, but we haven't reached that point quite yet. Elden Ring and this DLC offer so much variety on how to approach a situation or a boss that solutions are out there for any player willing to put in the time. Of course, not everyone has time, and this might also come at the cost of a desired build or playstyle, but options are there. I do sympathize with the team, as Elden Ring delivers an unbelievable amount of variety in build diversity, and trying to design bosses that weren't all pushovers was probably a nightmare. As a result, a bag of tricks has been dipped into more here than in previous Souls games, and it does start to feel a bit unfair. Giant AoE attacks, unending combos, overly aggressive behavior, and unruly cameras affect more than just a few bosses, and detract from what would feel like fair but appropriate challenge, at least in my opinion. For others, this may be different, and that's totally fine. I encourage you to share those thoughts, whether it's here in the comments, or on your own YouTube channel, or on forums, or wherever you're comfortable. Everyone's feedback is important in shaping the next experience. But to me, that is the most important takeaway I got from this DLC, that From will continue to push the boundaries of what's reasonable to expect of its player base. I will be interested to see if this sentiment remains in their next endeavor, whatever that may be. While I do find this important, I don't want it to overshadow how incredible this DLC offering is as a complete package. The team has found ways to make exploration more enjoyable than the base game by utilizing stunning vistas and radiant color palettes and placing them in a very open and vertical world full of moments of player discovery. Meanwhile, the lore and storytelling has been expanded on greatly, opening up tons of new opportunities for speculation amongst that passionate community. And for anyone who just wants to play the title over and over again, there's tons of new weapons and spells to shake things up, and that's always appreciated. Shadow of the Erdtree is a worthwhile experience, one that's easily worth having if you played and enjoyed the base game. While my concerns remain and my beliefs have been challenged, I can safely say that my faith in From Software has not been lost. They're still incredible. Duh. A second playthrough helped confirm that. So, like many in the Land of Shadows, following Mikola to the bitter end, I will do the same with From Software. But here's hoping that the sad day never comes. Thanks for watching. Alright y'all, I hope you enjoyed this look at Elden Ring's Shadow of the Erdtree DLC. I'd love to hear your thoughts on it in the comments below. I look forward to reading them alongside the comments telling me how awful I am at the game. Those comments are correct, by the way. Anyway, as for upcoming videos, well, I'm not sure. August has 2 games that interest me, Black Myth Wukong and Star Wars Outlaws. I'm leaning towards playing the latter, while using the first half of the month to finally finish Persona 3 Reload, and hopefully get that video out. Anyway, time will tell, and as always, I appreciate your patience. Thank you so much for watching the video. Please leave a like if you enjoyed it, consider subscribing for more, follow me on Twitter at NopNapNarp, join our Discord, the link is below, and as always, have a nice day, and take care.